Hi, I'm Tricia from Child to Child. I'm just interested to hear more about, Amy, you alluded to the importance of sort of menstrual hygiene management and supporting girls, but we've not really explored that in any depth today, and I was wondering if any of the panellists would be interested to say a bit more about that, because there's, you know, the overwhelming evidence that many girls drop out as a consequence of starting their menses and the impact that that has on their education. I'd just be interested to hear a bit more.
Thank you. I think right next to...
Thanks. Vicky Johnson, University of Brighton. I really like the sort of socio-ecological diagram of linking the girl to context. And I think through my research I've found that it's really helpful to think of the mechanisms which can help link children's agency to their context. And people have mentioned already creating safe spaces for children to build their capabilities, creativity, but also spaces for them to interact with people in positions of power, like policy decision makers, I think have been really helpful. Mechanisms of communication, capacity building. So I just wondered if people could reflect on those kinds of mechanisms for really kind of how to change the power dynamics. Thank you.
There's a question over here.
Thank you very much for the great presentations. Sammy from Save the Children. Thinking about the whole kind of continuum of education, right from ECCD all the way through to vocational training for adolescent girls, is there any evidence to point to, perhaps is there a point throughout this continuum of education where intervening in a holistic way for girls' education can yield sort of a greater impact on transformative impact for girls and for their empowerment? Is this something that the Young Lives project might shed lights on, for example, in a world of constrained resources and increasingly constrained policy choices? Is that something that we would want to explore a bit further? Where is it, where's the best time to intervene for girls and boys, for that matter?
Okay, and one couple more questions over here, and then we'll go to the panel.
Good morning, Catherine Nicol from Girl Effect. I heard a lot about gender norm change and gender transformative approaches to girls' education, and something that I think a lot of us are grappling with is measurement frameworks around that, of course, in terms of kind of long-term gender transformative change. So I'm wondering if any of you have any tips and tricks or reflections on what you've done within girls' education programs to measure gender norm change. Thanks.
Measurement of gender norm change. I think there was another over this side.
Rebecca from Street Child. You spoke about the societal and cultural kind of norms surrounding girls' education, but I was wondering more specifically if what role religion plays in preventing girls from accessing education, and if you'd encountered kind of more or less pressure from different communities depending on their religious affiliations.
Okay, I know there's 4 questions over here, and I'm going to take those in a second round, otherwise the panel will forget all the things they're being asked. And I have a couple online that are coming. So let's start at this end with Amy. Just select some of the questions. You don't have to answer them all. Just select those most pertinent to you, including also Rachel's comments, if you want to pick one of those up.
Okay, so I guess first of all, looking at the menstrual health management hygiene, it is something that Plan has identified as a key barrier, and different approaches that we use are around looking at what provision there is, both in hardware, so around sort of the privacy element of latrines, and sort of space for girls to go and use latrines privately, and then also around the provision of sanitary kits, and also how that can tie into even linking that up into sort of growth of local markets around how you make and where you buy them from. So sewing essentially, and making sure that then girls know how to best wash them and how to reuse and all that education around it. And again, I haven't got figures as to the impact it's had on that, but I think we are seeing linked with other approaches as well. It does definitely keep girls in and reduce absenteeism at school. Looking at, I'll pick another one around, so how we, sort of different mechanisms we've used to link girls up to people of power. We have got a few programmes around youth advocacy, and we've started using quite a structured approach to that, particularly with Malawi and Pakistan and Kenya. We've got some examples there of where we've been working over a number of years with girls, but also boys as youth advocates, where we work with them to identify a key area that is blocking them from accessing education, and then starting to look at ways with which they can get messaging across, and then identifying channels to which they can then access both their national governments, and then actually also taking that up to international. So I know at UNGA, for example, we did have some Malawian advocates there talking about the successes that they had around with this marriage bill. So it's sort of slow and steady, and I think we accompany them as they go along, but it is also around building up their confidence and looking at where those influencing points are and making it manageable as well. Looking at one of your discussion points, I guess, the challenge in the enabling environment and factors for success, I mean, it does sort of stem down to my own sort of experience around having to have a multi-pronged attack, so to speak. So it might be around identifying what is the most pressing need. Perhaps I'm going to take an example, actually not from Plan, but from Eastern Congo, where the primary system was in total disarray, and the most pressing need was that the schools weren't there and the teachers weren't there. So starting off, training up the teachers and that initial education need. But then looking at the deeper seated barriers around, interestingly, religious leaders who were preaching very negative messages around girls and access to education and the role of women as being subordinate to men in their churches, and with 99% of the population going to church, this was the one message they were hearing. So really working very closely with the religious leaders to look for positive messages coming out of the Bible and really trying to push that. And then looking again at then around the economic barriers. We weren't in a position to give bursaries at that stage, but to look at village savings and loans associations and really sort of hand up approaches to looking at, again, reasons as to why girls were dropping out in particular were around having to pay school fees at critical points in the school year, just before exams. And slowly building up on what was quite a small-scale programme initially, and building up those layers as we were gaining momentum in one area or another.
Thank you, Amy. Nora, would you want to select
Thanks.
some?
I would like to speak to the systems change issue, which is basically so fundamental. It's so fundamental to making any progress in terms of gender equality and addressing girls' education. UNGAI has taken this on for the last number of years. We've identified 2 strategic partnerships, and we've worked through these. One is with the Global Partnership for Education, and now in June they finally launched a policy on gender equality. And we have been working with them on a guidance for gender-responsive sector planning. So from our perspective, the way of getting at this holistic change that our colleague from Save the Children asked about is actually to introduce gender analysis into the thinking of education decision makers at the country level. They must go through a process of education planning, which includes analysis, planning, and appraisal. What we have done is create a tool which invites them to add gender to that conversation, to that thinking. So in fact, I'm not sure if there is a best entry point. What I think the entry point is actually to change the thinking of the sector owners, the government, the education, Ministry of Education, and also encourage them to reach out to their and give capacity to the gender focal point, the gender unit in the education ministry, who's often underinvested in, I don't know what you want to say, but with little power and authority. The education policymakers don't know anything about gender, and the gender focal point doesn't know anything about planning, and our intention is actually to correct that equation. The other institution or other partnership which we've considered to be strategic in system change is the education unions. Thus, we have a partnership with Education International, and we're doing some work on changing gender norms around school-based gender-based violence in and around schools. So school-based gender-based violence, what do we call this? School-related, thank you, I know this well. School-related gender-based violence. And our intention is to allow teacher unions to work with their members to change the culture of the school. And this is, again, a systems approach. We wanted to hear voices from the field, thus we put in place the Good Practice Fund, but for us, the real gain will be by changing the system. Thanks.
Thank you, Nora. Elaine?
I guess I'll expand on Nora's point and talk to Vicky's point, and it's also the entry point question, and I'll say something about measurement. I think it's important to work at the top, the middle, and the bottom. And Nora's outlined strategic changes that are at the top and the middle and the bottom. But I think there are a range of sites of the middle that are really important to attend to. And that, the example of young people taking their voices to the UN General Assembly is powerful, but it's sustaining and supporting that to happen beyond that one dramatic event. I think there are four very important areas. The one is this area called the public sphere, the area of the media, the area of information gathering. Rachel spoke about communication, and I think it's making gender equality the language of the public sphere and having that kind of discussion. The second are the civil servants at all levels and through all levels of training. And Nora's spoken about Ungai's entry point at the top level of government. But there are all those district officers, there are all the provincial officers, there are all the people, the circuit inspectors. That's a really important cadre that I think hasn't been looked at and needs to engage with the power. I've spoken about teacher education, and that's such a key area to engage in, plus the work that's done in universities training teacher educators. Higher education has been somehow removed, and yet there was a big article in the paper on Saturday about high levels of concern about violence against women on university campuses in the UK. So these are big issues that we shouldn't silence. And the fourth is NGOs, civil society. I guess that's touching your point about religious organizations. NGOs have done fantastic work in keeping the issue about girls' education, but many of them are not reproduce inequalities, and so it's that constant level of work with that group. On measurement, I'm very divided. I think there's a concern, a kind of misplaced concern with too much precision. So I think it's important to be precise, but it's also important to say there are things that we will need to be very imprecise about, and we need to think about ways of monitoring and measuring that listen to the complexity, allow us to understand power, and it's a hugely difficult language to try to talk. So I've been working with Ungai on looking at some possible indicators linked to the debates about the SDGs. I think it's a constant, and I could talk to you more about the different fields we think you could measure in, but I don't think the indicator is going to bring the social change. I think it's the social change that will give birth to the indicator rather than the other way around.
Okay, thank you. Gertrude, if you want to pick a a couple of points to respond to, and then I'm hoping to get in another round of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll quickly run through some of the questions. The key issue of best practices, how do they get to the policymakers and people who are like designing the policies and also the programs at national level? Like as an organization, ourselves, we sit in platforms where we sit with, like for instance, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Gender, where we share our own experiences on the ground so that these players, they must understand what is happening on the ground. One of the platforms is a technical working group, and we also have the sector-wide group, which is under the Education Ministry of Education. So this is where we share our own experience. An example is a issue of girls' hostels. Yeah, the issue of girls' hostels. For a long time, there's been that indication that we need to address the issues of distance, as well as finding space for girls to live, to accommodation where they're attending secondary school. But what we have been discovering on the ground is that most community-day secondary schools that have hostels constructed, the girls are still walking long distances because the fees to those boarding schools it automatically raises, because for them to sustain such structures, it means they have to raise the fees. So we feed back to the policymakers and program designers at national level for them to reconsider, to think through what would be the most effective way of addressing the issues of distance. Because as it were, some of the girls are still remaining like walking long distances because their parents can't afford to pay for school fees in girls' hostels, in schools that have girls' hostels. And apart from that, the other example is the issue of menstrual hygiene, the reusable pads. Like in the context of Malawi, we've seen that there's a lot of great adoption in terms of like reusable pads. But what we as an organization are also observing is the need to sort of promote education among communities to open up on menstrual hygiene, menstrual issues, because cultural issues, they still act as a barrier. The girls can't hang out their reusable pads in the sun. So they just shove them in bags, and sometimes it also affects, we think it can affect their health when they don't hang out these things in the sun. So we are trying to advocate for girls, for people in the communities, as well as even policymakers, to create an open space to begin to deal with the cultural barriers in terms of like understanding what menstrual hygiene is all about. In terms of research tools, somebody talked about diagnostic tools. I was going to say one thing that we also have to bear in mind, all of us as players, girls are not a homogeneous group. That's a starting point. Not every girl is the same. There are different categories of girls. So research work, tools that we are using in research work also must have that in mind, so that we are capturing the rightful things and we are getting the rightful measurements in terms of like getting the real issues from the girls. But apart from that, I think the other thing is that more indicators and more work has been focused on quantitative indicators and quantitative outcomes. And we need to strengthen qualitative outcomes as well, and qualitative indicators, because that's where we get more stories about the impact. They measure what has been coming out on the ground. Unfortunately, many donors or many funders, they rarely do not like support. Well, not rarely support, but sometimes because sometimes it requires a lot of investment in terms of like getting quality. Looking at quality indicators and quality impact, like for instance, the longitudinal studies. It takes a lot of resources and a long time to observe the gains. Sometimes these things are not easily used and not easily supported. And the other issue is about systems change. I wanted to say systems change must happen, yes, and it's very, very good. It should also happen at community level, at household level, because everywhere there are those systems. There are those systems at household level that are impeding on girls' empowerment, the systems at community level. All those systems must happen together with the other systems at national level. I was also thinking about the issue of, what is the other thing? Oh, the issue of religion, how it's interplaying efforts in terms of like girls' empowerment. Yes, most of the communities that we work in as an organization, such things, the social cultural issues are really coming out strongly because there are doctrines that are promoting girls to be silent, promoting girls to be submissive. So on one hand, we are promoting girls to be expressive, to be articulate, to be assertive. And on the other hand, when they go to those structures which are other informal education systems, you find that they are being taught something different. So I think it's time now that we need to find effort to harmonize both the informal and formal education systems. They must happen and they must talk to each other. They must not fight each other. So we need to find ways to harmonize or to ensure that these education systems are really talking to each other and helping to empower the girl. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude. I'm just going to abuse the power of the chair and respond to a couple of the questions there. One on the longitudinal evidence referred to Young Lives, a question from over here. And just to advertise that we are running a longitudinal study on adolescent girls over 10 years. It's called the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Programme, GAGE, funded by DFID, and it has social norms at the centre in terms of looking at change. So watch this space. We'll be, over the next few years, hopefully releasing quite a lot of information around that. And we, of course, work with Young Lives. I was very involved with Young Lives at its beginning, as many of my colleagues here. I also wanted to just make a point about the measurement of norm change. I really agree with Elaine on this. But, of course, donors constantly ask us for, how do we know if norms are changing? We did a piece of work with the SIGI index, which is the OECD DAC index, looking at potential indicators which would measure norm change, and having 3 ways of looking at one indicator, which included attitudinal change and prevalence. And so just trying to be smart about using existing data that's out there to see if change is happening, but you have to do it over the long term. And finally, a comment on the sort of menstrual issue. We just completed a 4-year study in Vietnam, Nepal, Ethiopia and Uganda, working at community level with adolescent girls, and it was absolutely striking how little they knew about menstruation, and that the communities and their parents, their mothers and their aunts and relatives are not talking about this, so that they were all very, very similar across all those very different contexts in not knowing anything about this. And in education, I think this probably speaks to sex education in schools as the very least of what needs to be done, let alone getting communities to talk about this. So very, very striking there. Okay, now we're going to have a very smart second round of questions. I've got some online as well, and I've got a lot of hands in the room, and then our panel is going to give a very smart and very short response to those questions. So they probably won't be able to answer your questions, but it's really good to hear the sorts of questions that are coming up from people. And then I'm going to move to the panel and actually to some people in the audience for some concluding remarks. So before I come to you, let me just read out the online questions. We're not going to be able to answer all these questions, but Ruth Naylor from Education Development Trust would like to ask Amy, will the Real Choices, Real Lives cohort be followed through adolescence? Susan Durston from Trustee at Child to Child would like to ask, what successes have there been in addressing power structures? These are the most difficult. Helosio Modesto from Code Canada would like to ask the panel, what are the concrete promising approaches to promote girl education within primary teacher education? Actually, an interesting question. We are in the GAGE project starting at 10 years old in terms of looking at adolescent girls. And Doreen Makoto would like to ask Gertrude, how sustainable is the strategy of scholarships to advance girls' education in Malawi and everywhere else? I've got about 10 hands in the room. I'm going to start over here. We were neglected before. So right at the back, a lady has had her hand up for a long while.
Thank you. I'm Madiha, also from Child to Child. And I was very interested in what Gertrude said in the beginning about how parents and communities have trouble recognizing the value of education because there are such limited opportunities ahead. And I was wondering what the experience of the panel was regarding what constitutes a useful education for girls in different contexts.
Okay. Some more questions over here. Gosh.
Tanya Popper, United Nations consultant. Innovation has is playing a big focus right now across the UN agencies. I just wondered how the panel has seen innovation address gender equality and improve girls' education.
Okay, moving forward.
Hi, thank you. My name's Claire Milligan. I'm from Save the Children. Just a question about, so a lot of what you've been talking about today is really interesting, and we're doing very similar things in Save the Children. I think sometimes it worries me that we're actually just only focusing on our programmes and not our organisations. And I'm actually wondering whether Plan or DFID, do you have any good examples of how senior management or the organisation itself is embracing gender equality as an organisation, not just here but also overseas? And how you've been going about that.
Okay, there's a couple more at the front.
Thanks very much. I'm Padmini Iyer from Young Lives in Oxford. It was really exciting to hear Gertrude and Amy and Rachel all talk about engaging boys and men. So this isn't a what about the boys question. I think it links more to the systems approach that's being discussed. And I'd really like to know what you think the scope is for shifting the global agenda from girls' education to a focus on gender and education. So, for example, thinking about how the relational ways in which gender norms and inequalities are reproduced in institutions and how those affect girls' and boys' education. Thanks.
Just here to your left, Trini, and then I'm going to move over here.
Thank you. Emily Echesa, Save the Children. My question is on backlash. Have you noticed any backlash issues in some of these projects? And if so, what evidence, if any, is emerging from these projects, and how can we better deal with this, especially gender-based violence?
Okay, over here, 2 questions here.
Thank you. Matt Jones, World Vision UK. Girls' empowerment and agency has been reflected on. I wonder if we... I'd like to know your thoughts actually a little bit more than this in terms of girls' participation in what we do. So, how are we ensuring that girls are informing our programs and our interventions? How are, in some circumstances, how are they even leading these programs themselves? So that we're not just being tokenistic about the role of girls in what we do, but that they're actually right there at the very heart. Thank you.
And the last question here.
We talk about, I'm Purna Sresh from VSO. So we talked about the education all the time, communities, but I'm just wondering from the panelists, like the relationship, especially the protection, when it comes about the protections and then home and the police and also the social welfare. So often the things relate to other agencies as well. So I'm interested to hear what can we learn? How can we really protect, not only empower girls, but when they are involved in those kind of incidents, how can we work across thematic areas? Thank you.
Okay, I think we can't take any more questions. They won't all be answered, I'm sorry. But I'm going to ask the panel to just take 2 minutes each to just make some comments. And then I'm also going to ask Paola Perenezzo here, who led on the project from the ODI side, to also do some summing up. And I'm going to start with Amy, but change the order thereafter. 2 minutes.
Okay, so for Ruth with the Real Choices, Real Lives, and going through to adolescence, as far as I know they're currently 10 years old, and there is a commitment to continue with that programme, but I can email her the answer. With regards to the organisational, I thought it was a really interesting question actually, and Plan International is just going through a big strategy change, and one of the values is around the organisation being gender supportive and gender aware. So yes, but it's an emerging theme. And then finally, just around, I guess, the relational, sort of the gender and having a shift from girls' education to gender, and something that I'm not going to answer it, but it is something that very much interests me. And I think certainly from the GEC programme, it's something that has become ever more apparent that sort of this... The risk of focusing just on girls and the backlash then that brings back, and the need to really know that this is, again, around power structures and making sure that gender isn't just about girls, it's around girls and boys. So a bit of a fobbing off, but yeah.
Are you still there? Okay, let's move to Nora.
Thank you. Some extremely important issues and questions were brought up in this round, as in the other one as well. I wanted to just say that I'm sorry to pick up similar points, but I'll try not to say the same thing. The question of how we're being consistent and coherent in our work so that our organization is internally consistent with our message is a really tricky one. The Global Partnership for Education went through a gender review, actually institutional review, which was funded by the Government of Canada, and the findings were extremely challenging. They therefore had to turn around and then started to do some significant work to create a gender policy, an action plan, what they were going to do about it. So asking that of our own organizations is really critically important. Ungai is not a big issue, but we are hosted by an organization which is extremely large, and although has a gender equality department and group which does a lot of important work looking at the structures of the system itself, the organization. I may need to go and ask some questions back home in UNICEF. It'd be an interesting thing to explore. I also think the questions of moving from a focus on girls' education to gender equality is the future where we are actually going. And I'm going to say once again, this is now called the gender review. It's not simply on monitoring progress towards of girls' education, but looking at the intersection between between education and gender equality. And this is, however, a much more difficult area to work. It is also not politically, doesn't sell as well as some others. It's easier to sell girls' education than it is to sell this big structural change of gender equality. However, it is the way we go. Ungai personally is in the process of questioning whether or not it's about to change his name to replace the G from girls to gender. So that's an indicator of where we are.
Great. Gertrude, I think we can hear you, if not see you. No, we can't. Okay, she's gone. Okay, so I'll move to Elaine.
I think I'm going to use the backlash question to work outwards. I think that there's it's part of what Nora was saying at the end. Girls' education, I think, has got so much traction because it appears a kind of change that can be made without change. It's cosmetic. It's who would be against girls' education? But you can do it in a very limited way, or you can do it in a very profound way. And I think we have to actually do it in all those ways. We need to do it looking at girls, we need to do it at looking at gender power, and then we need to do it looking at substantive things around equality, both the distributional aspects of equality and addressing all those horizontal inequalities around race or ethnicity. And I think unless we do that, we will always get backlash, but we need to work in ways that kind of strategize against the backlash. And so the question about how do you intervene in primary teacher education is a really crucial thing because it's an area that is ignored. This is, primary teachers often don't have lower levels of education. They've had very poor levels of education. They're carrying a huge burden on their shoulders. And that's, often the least amount of resources goes to the people who need it most. We need to invert the pyramid.
Okay, I'm going to ask Rachel for some final comments.
Thank you. I'm going to answer the question on what organisations, and the question was what DFID does. And I'd say three things: gender mainstreaming, leadership, and generating champions of change. I think on the gender mainstreaming, we're hugely lucky actually in DFID as an organisation in that we actually have a whole cadre of what we call social development advisors who are trained and have expertise in gender analysis and using gender tools in their work across the countries we work in. But we also have a department called Inclusive Societies Department who work tirelessly to ensure that actually gender is part of the DNA of the organisation. And I think we really have seen a significant shift in the last 10 years. in terms of how much attention is paid to this issue. And then that's fed through into more briefings and more attention for our ministers. And those of you who were at the event in July, our Girls' Education Forum, will have seen both our ministers there at that event championing gender. And I think, this really is something that we should celebrate. And one of the things we've done to try and broaden that out to inspire others and other organisations as well was at the Education World Forum this year, which is held every January. It's the largest gathering of education ministers anywhere, and 80 ministers were there. And one of the topics that we focused on was on gender and gender equality. And we actually interviewed ministers about what they're doing in their countries with help from the likes of Nora and Elaine to get the questions and the background research right, asking them really what works in your countries. And there's a great video of some of the short extracts from that up on the Education World Forum site. And so finally, I think champions of change. I think we've got a long way to go on this, but we've all heard here that we need at every single level, as Elaine said, champions who are going to make the difference. And sometimes we're not investing enough in supporting the capacity of those local voices, be those children, be they the teachers, be they the person analysing the data or collecting the education management information data. They know which schools are doing well for girls or not. Is that getting down? Are they being champions? Are they being empowered to speak out? To academics, religious leaders at every level. And I think there's more we can do and more progress we can make.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Paula to make some concluding comments. Paula led the research from ODI with Ungai. So I'm going to hand over to Paula. You have a microphone.
Well, it's been a fascinating process working with Ungai on this, and I am not the only sort of person at ODI working on this. Rachel Marcus, who's also in the audience, has produced some research pieces that will be shortly available online on our website, on Ungai's website, and as somebody was saying, in the next few months, there will be other interesting outputs, including on gender equality in conflict settings in education, and also on finance, some aspects of financing girls' education in school. So we're looking forward to producing those. And just to, a lot of the points that have been made are in the sense concluding remarks. So I don't want to repeat some of the issues, but I guess something that I was thinking about as you were talking is the issue of how do we ensure that the issues are understood? And we talked about top and middle level policymakers and decision makers, but it was interesting in working on the Good Practice Fund initiative with the 17 different organizations, that sometimes these issues are not even understood at the grassroots level in terms of what does gender responsive outcomes mean. I mean, for many of them, it's having an equal number of girls and boys, but not thinking about the transformations that need to happen in the behavior, actions, and thoughts of girls and boys in school and of teachers in school to affect these changes. So even thinking of ways of getting that very basic information through, I think will achieve a lot. And obviously at that very grassroots level, but also in middle level decision makers, that's crucial. Then on financing, which is a key issue, the report that Rachel was mentioning of the International Commission on Financing of Global Education does make a range of highlights many issues where financing needs to take place, but it does point out the need to find innovative approaches and finance innovative approaches to include the marginalized groups. And this links to the issue around systems. So how do we match up these very interesting grassroots NGO-led initiatives that tackle the needs of specific populations and are effective to bring them to the system and channeling different sources of funding, innovative funding, not only government, which is key, but also philanthropists and enterprise to finance successful stories, which will then can be scaled up. And I think a lot needs to be thought about how that scaling up is financed and happens, and sharing the information, and certainly goes back to Rachel's point about that. How do you communicate that evidence effectively across the board? And I think we need to do more to think about how to make those very interesting evidence reviews and reports digestible to decision makers and highlight the key points and say, well, this is what we need to change more effectively. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Paola. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, especially our panelists. Gertrude, who's unfortunately fallen off from Malawi, Nora, who came all the way from New York, we really appreciate it, thank you. And of course all the panelists who came a bit less far, mostly from London, I think. But we appreciate all of your presence here today, and all of you online as well, and in the audience. It's been a really, I think, fruitful and interesting discussion. We have a couple of small round tables which are invite-only round tables. I am going to start them a little late, so maybe just so the panelists can spend a few minutes here talking to people before we move into those rooms, which are just on the ground floor here for those people who are taking part. But do stay, and you can gather outside if you want to talk to each other, and we'll move into the round tables shortly. Thank you very much.